Thanks everyone for your patience. We're 10:05, so we'll get the webinar going right away here. And Otis will make the introductions, and we'll go through our normal webinar proceeding.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Michael. Thanks everyone for having the patience staying on for us whilst we tried to put on some technical thing for the webinar today. And welcome once again to our webinar. Today's webinar is being brought to you by the Rural Policy Learning Commons from Brandeis University. And today's webinar is being presented by Professor Diane Luca and Dr. Ray Bowman. So we have a little bit of program change today. Dr. Philomena will be chairing our webinar today, and Dr. Philomena will say we will give all thanks to her for bringing on board this webinar. So she will be chairing our webinar today for us. So without much ado, I'll sort of give a brief introduction of what the webinar is about, and then after that I will hand it over to Dr. Philomena. But before that, I would like us to do a couple of housekeeping, just so everyone online will know. After the presentation, there's going to be a Q&A session where you can forward your questions to our presenters, and that will be, I would say, that will be done by our chair for today. And please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen after the presentation. And you can also type in your technical questions into the chat box, also at the bottom of your screen. And the session will be recorded and posted on our RPLC YouTube channel. So following the presentation, we will send you the links to the videos and the slides, and also a short survey for you to assess how the webinar went today. So please take your time to complete the survey. And just as we all know, Zoom is a web-based platform, and interactions may occur due to the strength of your internet service. And if interactions occur, just feel free to visit zoom.us website and use the login ID that was given to you during the registration. So right now, I'll talk a bit about the topic for today, which is about youth unemployment in rural and urban Canada, which is being presented to us today by Professor Diane Luca and Dr. Ray Bowman. We all know unemployment affects young people globally in rural and urban areas. And in rural areas, unemployment among youth raises concerns that needs to be addressed. It is a general perception that urban areas provide more employment opportunities for youth. However, the issue of unemployment continues to be a major problem in urban centers. Faced with these challenges, our speakers, Diane Luca and Dr. Ray Bowman, will be presenting to us on their topic, youth unemployment in rural and urban areas in Canada. But before we start, we would also like to recall some of the works the Rural Development Institute has done on youth studies and also unemployment. We could all recall the work by Dr. Ryan Gibson on youth mobility, assessing youth mobility among Manitoba's economic regions from 2001 to 2002, and also from 2006 to 2007. Wayne Kelly, who is also the RPLC coordinator, has also been having extensive works on youth in leadership in digital futures. And Dr. Ray Bowman, who is one of our prominent, I would say, presenters today, has also done works with Professor Diane Luca on the demographics of rural youth workforce policy and practice. So without much ado, I'll turn on the microphone and give Dr. Philomena the nod to continue with the program right now, to outline and also introduce our presenters for today. So over to you, Dr. Philomena.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I think most of you are possibly in Canada, but for the few that might be in Europe, it's the afternoon, nearly the early evening. So welcome to this webinar. I'd just like to say, for those of you that haven't participated in this webinar before, it's brought to you by the Rural Policy Learning Commons. And I happen to be based in Scotland, in the United Kingdom, in a very rural place. In the Scottish Highlands, and I've been the theme lead for migration for the last 3 years. Hopefully there'll be some changes coming on board this coming year. But the webinar series has been one of the things that we've offered people, you know, through the RPLC. And I know that Diane, you know, some of you, probably many of you know Diane and Ray from their work and from their work in Canada, but we've been interested in not only exploring international migration, but also internal migration and social capital, human capital issues within the context of rural development. So certainly Diane's work and Ray's statistical work has been very important, and we're very pleased to be able to offer that to you today. And it will be made available as well on YouTube. I think that's what usually happens, and you can certainly pass the YouTube recordings on when you receive the notification of it, which I think Otis, the Brandon University staff who support the network will send on to you. So without saying any more, I'd like Diane to start presenting. There will be an opportunity for questions. You have to type them in your chat box, and I will read them out, and then certainly Ray and Diane can respond to them as they wish. We will try to keep this finished by within an hour is what we normally expect, but given technical difficulties and so on, we may just slightly run over. But the idea is to enable people to just dip out of their work for an hour and participate in these webinars without being too disruptive. So thank you for coming, and Diane, please start with your presentation.
Okay, can you all hear me?
I can hear you. Sure, but...
Well, thank you all for coming and for having some patience with our technical difficulties that seem to plague the wonders of computer use. So this presentation has an interesting history. It started with some work that I did for a panel in Quebec City, and Ray and I had also done a paper for that. So for this webinar, I was going to combine the two, and then Ray came up with all kinds of other wonderful charts that he thought would complement what we'd already done. And so I thought it was only fair to make him co-author. So you'll see all his wonderful charts. The deal is that I do the presentation, but he is here to answer questions if need be. So here's the outline of the presentation, which I'll try to go through fairly quickly. So there are some time for questions. First of all, we need to look at some context, cautions, and caveats. One of the things to keep in mind is the definition of rural. Statistics Canada has at least 3 different definitions of your rural that it uses, and that of course may be different from those used in other jurisdictions. So there's census rural, which looks at population centers of less than 1,000, and urban is anything larger than that. There's rural and small town, where any area that's less than 10,000 is considered rural and small town, and those are compared to census agglomerations and census metropolitan areas. And sometimes there's a comparison of just the same metropolitan areas, 100,000 plus, and non-metro. There are at least 6 million people classified as rural or non-metro using any one of these definitions in Canada. So it's a significant number of people. Now, but there's a lot of variation within rural areas, even in Canada. And one of the distinctions that has been highlighted, and is highlighted in many of the Statistics Canada analyses, is how close they are to urban centers. So the metropolitan influence zones. And so you see there the definitions of how many workers commute to an urban center to work is the definition, is the criteria that's used to define whether it's strong, moderate, or weak MIZ, metropolitan influence zones, or so far that no workers commute to work. Now, it's important to keep in mind these different definitions because depending on the data set that's used, different definitions are used, and obviously it will matter. And I give you there the distribution of rural and small town populations in Canada in 2016, and note that most of them are in strong or moderate MIS, even if they're in rural and small town. They're near urban centers. Just slightly over a quarter of the rural and small town population in Canada, which is itself 20% of Canada's population, is in weak or no MIS. So another issue to keep in mind, and this is very, very important, I'm going to keep coming back to it, is a person, a youth in this context, rural, or is a place rural? So if youth move to urban areas for education or work, Statistics Canada counts them as urban. But the question for us is, do we want to provide employment for youth from rural areas or for youth in rural areas? It's quite different. So if you provide employment for rural youth, but it means they have to move to urban, is that what your policy is? Is that your preferred policy? It is important to know that rural Canada is growing, but communities can be and are reclassified as they grow. So successful rural places become reclassified as urban places, even though the human beings living there have not moved and they may not think of themselves as urban at all. Urban concentrations in Canada are very near the southern border, and the distribution of rural and urban areas varies widely across Canada. So I'm going to show you some maps and graphs. Here's the graph to show that the census rural, which is the blue line at the bottom, is growing and has been growing almost every census since 1851. A lot of the dips, the few dips that you see, are due to reclassification. However, it's not growing anywhere near as quickly as the larger population centers of 1,000 or more, and therefore it's a smaller and smaller percentage. But it's not that there are fewer people in rural. That's important to keep in mind. So what is the distribution? Here's a map that shows it's in 2006. We don't have an updated one, but it's very similar. The line here is 100 kilometers from the southern border. And you can see by the dark areas, that's where the urban concentrations are, high population density. But you'll see that there is a distribution of rural areas, especially in the prairie provinces and in much of the maritime provinces. And all this black area are very sparsely populated, but not necessarily unpopulated areas. Here's another view of the same thing, same kind of thing. This is the classification of rural and small town areas. I apologize to anybody with red-green color blindness. The dark red are census metropolitan areas, and the dark green are those that are in strong metropolitan influence zones, strong MIS. And again, you can see there is a distribution of other rural throughout the very vast land that is Canada. So there's other variation within rural as well. There are very different issues in the north of the provinces and in the territories, which are the sparsely populated areas. Different issues for Aboriginal youth, on and off reserves. And also, even though the formal measure is proximity to an urban area, it also matters whether or not one rural area is close to other rural areas. For example, in Nova Scotia, there's almost continuous population around the edge of the province. So rural areas may not be close to an urban area, but they are close to other rural areas with various facilities. And that's different than in some of the Northern Ontario communities, for example, or in the prairies where they're quite widely dispersed. So employment issues are very different depending on where rural areas are relative to urban centers and other rural areas. And one thing I want to emphasize is that if we're looking at policy issues, too often the policy is driven by how many people will benefit, in which case you put your policy initiatives in urban centers, rather than how much benefit there will be to those who need it. So for example, I did some research on opportunities for young people who dropped out of high school. And in the urban area of Halifax in Nova Scotia, there were federal initiatives, provincial initiatives, municipal initiatives nonprofit organizations, all who were targeting high school dropouts. Outside Halifax, there was virtually nothing. So any policy initiative would have dramatic impact on those youth outside Halifax, and probably very little impact inside Halifax because there were so many other alternatives available to them. So that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about policy and how we're going to decide what policies to undertake. So what is some of the background from the research? There are a lot of references that will be at the end of this PowerPoint, and if the RPLC is not able to make the PowerPoint itself available, you'll have my email address, and I'd be happy to share those references with you. So any discussion of rural youth involves a discussion of mobility, which is why it's of interest to this section of RPLC. Even though rural youth are more mobile than urban youth, the majority of them, 60 to 70%, either stay in rural areas or return to rural areas after they've completed post-secondary. So it's not that most leave. However, very few of the urban youth move to rural areas at all. So more of the rural youth than urban youth move to the other type of area. And that's something that could be addressed with policy, and I'll come back to that. When one moves from a rural to an urban area, especially for a young person, it involves not only leaving your home community, but leaving your parental home. There's a different culture, the anonymity of urban when you're used to everybody knowing everything for good or ill in a small town. Handling public transportation. Public transportation is virtually non-existent in many rural areas. The whole urban scene, it's quite a culture shock for a lot of rural youth, especially when they're from a very small community that's far from an urban area. It's often social networks or family responsibilities that pull the youth back to rural areas, and parents can provide a lot of backup in terms of social support nets and housing when they're between jobs, when they're looking for jobs, when a marriage is broken up, and so on. Urban youth can avail themselves of this support from their parents without necessarily leaving their friendship networks and other supports. That's not so for rural youth who've moved away. So I think it's important to keep that difference in mind when we're looking at mobility patterns for rural versus urban youth. So what is the mobility pattern for rural youth? Here we see Canada-wide the net out-migration, in this case, of those 15 to 19. So these yellow bars that are all showing negative migration show that over time, even though it's decreasing a bit, that there's net out-migration of 15 to 19-year-olds. That would be mostly the 18 to 19-year-olds that are leaving for post-secondary. And for 20 to 24-year-old, again, we see the yellow bars at the bottom shows that there's net out-migration of this age group from, in this case, non-metro areas. And we're switching definitions of rural here. It's decreased in recent years, but it's still more are leaving this age group, more leaving non-metro areas than are coming into non-metro areas. When we go to a slightly older age, we see that there is slight net in migration. So it's really the youth that are mobile, as we know, because many of them are mobile for education, which is why it's important to look at education. Even though, as a whole, rural residents have lower educational levels than urban, rural youth have for some time been as likely as urban to pursue post-secondary options. There's no difference in the number that go on beyond compulsory education. However, they are constrained by local options. In Canada, there's a distinction between attending a college, which is often a preparation for more targeted and specific jobs, as opposed to universities. If there's a college nearby, youth in rural areas tend to attend the college rather than the university. So depending on the proximity of particular types of post-secondary institutions, that will affect the choices made by rural youth. Proximity of institutions is not an issue for urban youth because virtually every urban area has an option, both a college and a university. Maybe not the program they want, but there are options available. So as we said a couple of slides ago, for rural youth, if you're going to an urban center for education, which you often have to do, you want to pursue university, it means leaving your parental home and leaving your home community. One of the effects of rural youth leaving their home communities to pursue post-secondary education is that they may educate themselves out of being able to find work in their rural community because some of the employment options are very restricted there. And even though some rural communities have a challenge filling high-skilled jobs, it's a matter of finding a match between the skills that the young people have attained and the kinds of jobs that are available. There are some solutions to these sorts of things that we can look at in terms of policy initiatives. Distance education can facilitate access for some, although that's obviously not a panacea across the board. There has been an expansion of university-level programs to former colleges, especially in rural areas, especially in the western part of Canada, and that does make university-level programs available to rural youth. I've argued for some time that there should be supports provided from universities for those who move from rural areas to urban areas to attend universities, but universities seem unaware of this as an issue, despite the fact that I keep trying to tell them that. There are support programs for students with disabilities, for immigrant students, sometimes for Aboriginal students, but the idea that rural students might need particular supports seems to fall on, it's not heard. Post-graduation preparation in terms of where do we go from here once we get our degree would be an asset for many students, not just rural students, but certainly if they want to go back to rural areas, if not their rural home, then they might need some advice on how to make that transition. And so again, that's a place where universities could facilitate things. But of course, the bottom line is we need more jobs, more and more diverse jobs in rural areas if we want to get the rural youth who have post-secondary education, particularly university training, to move to, or to have urban youth move to rural areas. And this might include youth entrepreneurs creating their own jobs. So those are some policy initiatives that could be considered. So now that's the background. Let's look at what is the situation of employment at the Canada level. Oops, and there's a typo on the screen. It should be employment of youth 15 to 19 versus 20 to 24. So as we'll show in the next couple of slides, it's not new that youth unemployment is higher than that for adults. It's a long-standing tradition. Those less than 25 years of age have for some time had lower rates of employment, higher rates of unemployment. Part of that is trying while they get settled into a job, perhaps. So the important thing is to focus on those who need support. Not all youth need support, nor do all rural youth need support. We need to identify those who are struggling and those who are at risk and not getting the experience they need to succeed in the labor market. No one stays a youth, whether they want to or not. Most, as far as we can tell, will find good, steady employment as they age. That's why the situation is better for older individuals. But there are some who are disadvantaged. And it's really important that we identify those and target those in policy initiatives, not just undertake broad sweep things to address the issue of youth unemployment. So here we see the trend over time since 1953. The red line are the individuals under 25 years of age. This is rural and urban together. We're not separating them at this point, compared to those 25 years of age and over. And here you can see it's not new that youth have higher rates of unemployment. And one of the things we're going to emphasize in the next few slides is that the issues for those 15 to 19 are very, very different than those for 20 to 24. So when we group all youth under 25, we're mixing apples and oranges to some extent. We're confusing the issue. The young group, 15 to 19, 73% of those who are unemployed are students. For those 20 to 24, only a quarter of those who are unemployed are students. So for the younger group, unemployment is mostly an issue of unemployment among students. So there's a need perhaps for summer work or part-time work during the school year. They're not looking for full-time employment because they're students. For those 20 to 24, unemployment is mostly an issue of unemployment among non-students. So this is the age group where we need to be targeting those who are looking for employment as an alternative to formal schooling, or those who are looking for employment after completing post-secondary education. So in order to get a full picture of this, we have to look not only at unemployment, but also employment rates, and also those not in education or training. So just to reiterate, a different way of looking at it, different kind of percent, 85% of those overall who are 15 to 19 are students, before we looked at the percent of those in that age group who were unemployed, and a minority of those 20 to 25 are students. Less than half of those 15 to 19 are in the labor force at all, whereas 3/4 of those who are in the older age group are in the labor force. So it's important to, when we're looking at the next couple of charts, these are not unemployment rates, but it's the percent of the population unemployed, and unemployment rate is the percent of those in the labor force, those looking for work, percent of unemployed over those employed plus unemployed. We're going to be looking at the percent of the population unemployed so that the percentage is total to 100. So here we have all youth on the far left. Dark blue are those employed full-time, pale blue employed part-time, the black is unemployed, and the gold is those not in the labor force. If we look at non-students in 15 to 19, remember they're less than half of the 15 to 19-year-olds, we see that most of them are employed, either full-time or part-time. Okay. Compare this, memorize this chart with this. This is 20 to 24-year-olds, and here we see that most of the non-students are employed. A lot of the full-time students, which was true in the former, the full-time students tend not to be in the labor force in both age groups, and that's to be expected. They're students. They're not feeling the need to be employed. So the critical thing might be here for the non-students, how many are unemployed and how many are not in the labor force. These patterns are very gendered. Overall, there are more males than females that are unemployed. Among those that are not students, males are more likely than females to be employed full-time. And regardless of student status, females are more likely than males to be employed part-time. And more females are not in the labor force, often because of family responsibilities. So here's 15 to 19-year-olds. And as I said, males are more likely to be unemployed, which means the black bars in each of the categories for males is larger than for females. Males among non-students are much more likely to be employed, which is the dark blue bar. The light blue bar shows that in every category, females are as likely or more likely to be employed part-time. And among non-students, this gold bar shows that females are more likely to be not in the labor force. We see in terms of the gender differences, the same pattern here for 20 to 24-year-olds. More males than females are unemployed, more non-student males are employed full-time. More female non-students are not in the labor force. And overall, more females are employed part-time. So, to conclude this section, it's a long-standing fact that youth less than 25 years of age have higher unemployment rates than older individuals. Age matters. 15 to 19-year-olds have different employment patterns than 20 to 24-year-olds, primarily due to the differences in student status, and male and female youth have different employment patterns. So as I've said, it's important to remember that no one stays a youth. Some of these issues in terms of employment will be resolved as youth age. We need to focus on those who need the most support, which is not all youth nor all rural youth. But now, finally, let's get to what is the situation of youth employment and unemployment in rural as compared to urban areas. Here we see the distinction in terms of rural and small town areas by age group. The gold bar on the far left are large urban centers. The dark blue bar is rural and small town added all together. The light blue bars are rural and small town, that same number of people disaggregated into their metropolitan influence zones. Strong MIS close to urban centers, moderate, weak MIS, no MIS, and rural and small town in the territories. So we see that for 15 to 19-year-olds, overall, unemployment rates for youth are higher in urban areas, not in rural areas. The only place where there's higher unemployment rates for youth 15 to 19 than urban areas are in the territories. In 20 to 24-year-olds, again, looking at those comparisons, overall, the unemployment rates for those in large urban centers are higher than those in the rural and small town. It's in the weak MIS, no MIS, or rural and small town in the territories. Those that are far from urban centers, or where more literally where fewer workers commute to urban areas, or no workers commute to urban areas. So, and they're a very small percentage of the overall rural and small town population. But this is where there are issues. There are issues for rural youth, but they tend to be those in rural areas that are distant from urban communities. The last one is the older labor force, 25 to 64-year-olds. And we see there that that's where, in fact, you see an overall difference between the rural and small town compared to the urban centers, where the rural and small town have higher unemployment rates. So it's the older workers in rural and small town that have higher unemployment rates than urban centers. However, so this repeats what I just said, so I won't go over that. But it's important to keep in mind that youth who leave the rural areas for work in urban centers, who physically move and set up residence in urban centers, are then counted as urban. Okay, so some of the younger rural youth have moved to urban areas, and so the unemployment rates will be low in the rural areas because the unemployed youth have left. Some of these unemployment patterns have shifted over time, and get ready because we've got some of Ray's wonderful charts coming up here. Okay, there you go. Isn't that clear? So these are the youth unemployment rates from the Labor Force Survey, plotted monthly. The black squiggly lines are rural and small town, and the greenish squiggly lines goes up and down are for large urban centers. You can see that there's a lot of variation over the course of the year, which is why those spikes and dips happen. Here, those same lines are smoothed out using 12-month moving averages. And we can see, because the red line here, since about 2012, rural and small town rates for youth aged 15 to 24, the unemployment rates are lower than for large urban centers. If we look at employment rates, in some ways the flip side of that, again, you see a lot of month-to-month variation, and particularly higher peaks for the rural. And here those lines are smoothed out using 12-month moving averages. And here we see that employment for youth age 15 to 24 is higher in rural and small town areas. So, youth employment has been higher in rural and small town areas compared to urban centers since 2010. Youth unemployment, those 15 to 24, has been lower in rural and small town areas since 2011. And these patterns hold for both males and females. But there's a lot of seasonal variation in these rates, and rural employment is higher and rural unemployment is lower, mostly because of employment in rural areas in the summer months. So again, when you're looking at policy initiatives, you need to take that fact into account. So, what are some of the other employment issues in rural areas? Employment options are often more restricted in rural areas in both numbers and in range of occupations. It's often, as I mentioned earlier, challenged to match the skills that particularly youth bring and the job vacancies. There are a lot of employment options provided by single large-scale employers, but there are also challenges, especially if they close or they move or they change their policies or they decide on different hiring initiatives. Transportation is a major issue in rural areas, especially the small, more distant rural areas. Public transportation is either restricted or totally non-existent in many rural areas, and that has serious implications for youth. When they're trying to travel to a job, means they have to have private transportation, which they may not be able to afford if they don't have a job. Broadband access is still restricted in many rural areas in Canada. There's been initiatives for many years now where it's been promised that high-speed internet will be available in all areas, but it is not yet the case, especially in remote rural areas and in the territories. There's often, because of the restricted number of occupations available, there's restricted information about what options there are. And so youth, when they're making their decisions about post-secondary, making their decisions about what job they might like to go into, they are not necessarily aware of the options that are available. So what are some solutions? Well, we can increase the exposure of youth to career options, not just rural, but also urban youth. And we've been trying to do that, as far as I know, for many, many decades. Schools are one place that might be optimal because of the compulsory schooling, but it's not clear how effective they are. We tend to assume that our schools are going to be the solution to everything, and we expect them to do so much. It's incredible. It's clear that if the schools could be effective, there's certainly ways in which that contribution can be increased by providing other kinds of ways of exposing youth to career options. Chambers of commerce and other localized organizations might be options. A support for a range of work experience programs. More and more post-secondary institutions are trying to do that, but there's certainly potential to expand that. So again, that youth can get exposed, particularly those in rural areas, can get exposed to the options. And I would argue it's also important to expose urban youth to rural areas. And that would facilitate mobility to rural areas of those who do have the skills that are needed in the rural areas. There was an interesting program in Australia that I heard about where urban youth were taken to a farm and shown that. And many of them had never spent any time, except perhaps as tourists, in any rural area. And they didn't realize that it was a possibility. So that's something that certainly there's potential for great increase in policy initiative. Supports for telework and distributed work sites would facilitate work from rural areas. And while we're heading in the direction of more of that, there's certainly room for improvement. And economic diversity is needed in rural areas. This is nothing new. People have been saying this for many decades. It is important but it's complex to orchestrate. That doesn't mean we should say, oh, we can't do it because it hasn't been totally successful so far. There are areas where it has been. Encouragement of small and medium enterprises in rural areas have been particularly effective. This has happened and it needs to continue. And clearly we need expansion of broadband internet to rural areas, including in the north of many of the provinces and in remote areas and in the territories. So, youth employment varies. It varies by age, it varies by gender, and it also varies by rural versus urban location. There are different issues, so you have to be clear what group you are targeting. Youth unemployment is a long-standing issue. It's not a new hot topic, and not all youth face unemployment. We need to focus our policy initiatives on those who need it, which means we need continuing research to identify those who need it. Given the numbers and given the distribution of rural across Canada, it's clear that rural areas and rural people are a very important part of Canada, 6 million people or more, depending on your definition. Youth in and from rural areas face different challenges from those in and from urban areas. Rural youth may move to urban areas, but they often want to return home or at least live in another rural areas. Those that are far from urban centers and in the territories are most at risk in terms of unemployment and not having a good fit between their skills and their employment possibilities. Employment opportunities in rural areas, especially those rural areas far from urban centers, are key to having youth employment there. So again, coming back to a point I hope I've been emphasizing throughout this presentation, we have to decide if the policy target is for providing employment for youth from rural areas, excuse me, or for youth in rural areas. Is moving youth to an urban area the solution? Many youth and many rural areas would argue it is not. So we have to come up with other kind of innovative solutions. And that concludes my presentation. There are, as I said, a number of slides of references. I won't go through those. Those are our emails. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, I'd be happy to send it to you. And that is a view from space, which shows the light and shows the distribution of rural and urban in Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane. And that was really interesting. And I'll open it up to questions, but maybe if I may make some comments, because just from a Scottish and a UK perspective, you know, there are many, especially the Scottish remote rural area perspective, the Highlands in particular, where we've struggled with youth leaving the Highlands and rural areas in particular. But I just have a couple of questions that if I could start it off, and then I know that there are questions coming up on the Q&A, but I wondered to what extent there are two different aspects that I've seen in the context of Europe in particular, where the research seems to suggest that young women tend to leave more than young men. So mobility amongst women can be higher than young men or youth, even when it comes to those who are moving on to a post-school education. And whether there's also a sort of link between a socioeconomic status. Perhaps it's not such a big issue in Canada, I don't know. But in the UK, you know, the impact of socioeconomic status is very important on youth aspirations. And, you know, to what extent, so for, as an example, you know, one of the things that's very evident is in the schools, and it's communicated in all sorts of subtle ways and sometimes not so subtle ways, that if you want to succeed, you leave rural areas. If you stay in a rural area, you're actually a failure. And so there's a lot of sort of unintended or messages that get conveyed to young people, and that affects young people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds more than it does of higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So I don't know if that is an issue in Canada, or or whether you've looked at it and whether you wanted to comment on it.
Okay, two things. One, the gender differences. There are some gender differences in why people leave, certainly in Canada, and I'm sure a lot of other countries. Females are more likely to go on to university, and so in that sense, they'd be more likely to leave if a rural area if there's not a university there. Females are also more likely to follow their partner. So they will move to be with a man more than a man will move to be with a woman. And when you're getting into the 20 to 24-year-olds, relationships come into play. So there are some interesting gender differences, but it does vary considerably, certainly across Canada, depending on the area that you're looking at. So there's not one clear pattern. Those two tendencies tend to be there. But it depends on whether or not, for example, in Nova Scotia, you could commute to a university from a lot of areas, and there are some rural universities. In terms of socioeconomic status, yes, it very much does affect aspirations. It affects it in terms of parental encouragement and support, but it also does affect what kinds of aspirations the young person has. Those that are higher economic status tend to assume that they will go on to post-secondary, usually university. In terms of people leaving being defined as failures, it was very interesting in some research I did where we asked the young people, how would you describe those who leave and how would you describe those who stay? Looking particularly at those in rural areas, they said those who leave are those who want to make something of themselves, who are independent, who have high expectations. But what surprised me, that didn't surprise me, what surprised me was when we asked them about what about people who stay, they didn't have the flip side negatives of those. They had other alternate positives. Those are the people to whom community matters. Those are the ones who are dedicated to their family. Those are the ones that for whom family relationships and community matter a lot. So they didn't necessarily accept that definition of I'm a failure because I left. But there also is some research, and this is confirmed by some of the research I've done, that young people who leave rural communities, go away for post-secondary and come back, there's tension in their friendship networks because now they feel like they don't fit in. Their friends think that they're putting on, oh, you're better than I am, even though they may not be. And so there are some certainly tensions in terms of that mobility. And I think we need more information about the dynamics of that mobility. So you're quite right about those being issues. I can't hear you. Your phone's muted. Your microphone's muted.
I have to remember that all the time. Linamar has asked a question about, okay, I'm going to read it out. It's, is there not a distinction in the census forms to classify temporary residency in urban or rural areas as we do with visitors or tourists, for instance? So that was in relation to one of your first slides. And the second aspect of her question was about, could we have an idea about the quality of jobs in rural areas that may be different, I suppose, in urban areas? I mean, if they have jobs, are they good jobs comparing rural versus urban or vice versa? You know, the notion of a good job, I suppose.
I'll take a stab at this and then I'll pass it over to Ray, who hopefully will unmute his microphone and answer. In terms of the second part, I didn't quite catch the first one, so I'll answer the second part and then you can repeat the first one. My answer to are they good jobs would be it depends. It depends whether or not you're talking about rural Alberta or rural Newfoundland. So Canada is such a vast country that the employment options vary considerably depending on whether or not you're near, as I said earlier, near urban centers or near other rural centers. And certainly employment options in the different parts of Canada, the different provinces of Canada, vary considerably. There are higher unemployment rates in some areas of Canada, in which case the jobs may not be good jobs, but in other areas, in Ontario, in British Columbia, and Alberta, the jobs in rural areas might be very good, particularly in some of the areas that do attract a lot of tourists. There would be a lot of good jobs serving the tourist industry. Ray, do you want to say something?
I don't know how to change the.
Okay, so you come in here and talk.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on Lenimore's question on temporary residence on the census, the quick answer is I think there's no way to tell whether a person is a temporary resident. You can find out, did the person move into this community within the last year? But I don't think that's temporary. That's just mobility rates. So I don't know of how to find a temporary resident on the census. Well, quality of jobs in rural areas, I think everybody in rural areas would say it's good to have a job, as opposed to do you have a good job? I put the good in a different place in the sentence. It's good to have a job.
Okay. Philomena, you're muted again.
I'm going to move, yeah, okay, I've unmuted it. Maybe I should just leave it unmuted because I keep forgetting. Yeah. Okay, so Dan Fontaine has asked a couple of questions. One of them is, does age discrimination contribute to these differences, I suppose, or is it simply a factor of employers looking for employees with education and experience and the time it takes to attain it?
By age discrimination, you mean why there's higher employment among the older workers?
Yeah.
I don't know. I would assume some of it is because the young people have not yet settled into a job. There's going to be the probability that they would have the perfect job as soon as they walk out of post-secondary, even though all of them hope they're going to do that, is unlikely. So they would go through periods of unemployment. And whereas once you have a job that you are satisfied with, you would tend to stay in it. So as you age, you're more likely to have found that job. I don't know that there's employer discrimination. I think that's a separate kind of research question. Some employers would prefer younger workers because A, they have the latest skills, most updated education, and also they cost less than more experienced workers. So, but I don't know. And Ray says he doesn't know either.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think I'm not sure. Yeah, no, I won't comment on it yet, but I'll just move on to the next question, which was, when I was a youth, this is from Dan again, when I was in my youth, I invested in post-secondary and stayed in school longer, as it was commonly believed that career-oriented employees would not hire persons less than 25 years of age.
So what's a question?
So no, it's not a question, it's a comment, I think.
Okay.
Which is kind of interesting. I mean, the sort of something not quite the same that I have, you know, and it's not based on any real research that I've seen, but I'm aware that, for example, some of the students that come because the University of the Highlands and Islands also has parts of their provision that is like the college provision that you were talking about in Canada. We call them further education colleges, and they offer vocational training mainly. And, you know, I have come across young people who will choose to go from school to a local college because they don't feel ready to move away from their family connections and spend a couple of years at the college before they go to a university. You know, so that there is, I don't know how extensive that trend is, but there is that trend where people will delay going to a university because, you know, they feel that they need some time to adjust to being away from their sort of environment and from their family, I guess, as well. So it's kind of interesting. And, you know, it does come up in various things, but
yeah, that's a kind of, I've actually looked at that a fair bit, and I did mention it in passing in terms of the background of the research, the challenges that urban youth can leave their home, their parental home, and the home community, but they don't have to, because there would be options in their city, whereas rural youth often will have to leave. And Mike Corbett's work on Learning to Leave talks about that in a lot of detail. The conundrum that faces rural youth who may not feel that they're ready or don't want to leave their parental home yet.
I mean, it's in, and you know, that, for example, and that's a very important important point, particularly in the context of quite a number of rural universities that have been developed in the last 15 years in rural areas of the UK, where, you know, the universities have been established in places like the Highlands and Islands, where there wasn't university provision before, where young people had to go about 300 miles or more to a university. And the whole argument for having the new universities established on different campuses, if you like, across the region, was based on the argument that they wanted to keep the youth here. Well, what's interesting, because I did do a study in 2008 where we were asked to look at the demographics and the socioeconomic background of the students who were availing themselves of this opportunity, and it tended to be mostly what was called the non-traditional entrants. So it was largely young people who came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who didn't have probably the qualifications needed to get into a university, or who had parental responsibilities, or, you know, were single parents and so on. So the university then badged itself as widening access to education, you know, so it's an interesting kind of, you know, that's how it saw itself, as being trying to encourage people to come into education, and that's very much how it sees itself even now. So it's an interesting kind of, you know, just trying to draw parallels between. So I think that Linamar, I think, makes a point rather than a question, but, you know, which you made, Diane, which is when youth move to urban areas, they're counted as urban, but in reality they could be rural because they go back to their places of origin. And this is the point that you made anyway. Now, Dan, and then there's another one as well. So Dan asks another question: is there any data on the impact of the co-op programs on attraction of rural youth enrolling in an educational program? And is there any data on the impact of co-op programs on employability or actual full-time employment for graduating students?
That's outside my area of expertise. There may be others that are listening that could answer that. I did some work on the Transition to Work program here in Nova Scotia. That was a pilot program put on by what was then called Human Resource Development Canada. But one of the things about co-op programs in some universities, for example, is that they're targeted to honor students. And so there's only a select group of people that would be eligible. But that varies depending on the institution, and more institutions are broadening the co-op programs. But I don't know the data on co-op programs or on the outcome of co-op programs. So I'd welcome information on that.
Yeah, that's great. So if there's anyone out there that would like to sort of, send information, even if you sent it to Diane and then we could circulate it to the whole group, that would be very welcome. So move on to Patrick Levesque, and he asks the question: do you know the rise in precarious employment, contractual part-time, is being experienced similarly in rural and urban areas?
This is Ray. A quick answer is yes. The first part of the answer is precarious employment is not increasing very much, if at all. So that's the first observation. And I'm basing this on some fact sheets I've done for the Rural Ontario Institute. So I could send you the links to those, comparing metro and non-metro. So non-metro is outside places of 100,000 or more. And since the recession in non-metro, there's basically been no increase in precarious employment. And I have to go and look, rural, metro and non-metro, the levels of precarious employment are quite similar. So I had a fairly thick line. I think the lines were on top of each other. So I don't think there's a big difference, but I'd have to go and remember the different indicators I used for precarious employment.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, in the UK, the notion, because I think we all have, we've all had different social policies and economic policies and labor policies, I guess, across different nations. And certainly in the UK, precarious employment is not just confined to urban areas. It's also very relevant to rural areas, and it's an issue that comes up constantly in discourse about rural labor markets. Is the precarity or precariousness of employment, and particularly given the dominance of the service sectors and agriculture and so on. So, and the constant discourse is that we don't have highly skilled work. But recently, just in the last couple of days, at the same time, we have schools not being able to recruit teachers, and the health service not being able to recruit family practitioners, doctors. And there's been a big drive to start to change that. And Aberdeen University, which is about 300 miles from here, from at least Inverness, has decided to now develop a course where they're going to try and attract doctors that want to be trained to be working in rural areas. And I know that they've been doing something similar in Australia, where you have to, they'll be working in rural areas throughout their training and so on. And there's been quite a big push in terms of getting, at that, the professionals in particular, because they can't recruit people to come in and work up here. So there's, on the one hand, there's this discourse of precariousness. On the other hand, we do have difficulties attracting people to the north, as it were. And it's become quite a serious issue.
Yeah, and that's true in Canada as well.
Yeah.
Philomena, a couple of comments. One on precariousness among lower skills. Yes, that's true, but there's a lot of precariousness among higher skills.
Yeah.
Just talk to all the university professors, quote unquote, who are not tenured, and they don't know until 2 weeks before the start of the term whether their contract is renewed. So those are highly skilled people in a very precarious situation. And on your issue of rural doctors, the rural Ontario, there's a Northern Rural Doctors Program. I got to get it better, out of Laurentian University and Lakehead University, that are training doctors in the north to stay in the north, and it's been quite successful as far as I know.
Yeah. It seems like that, I certainly have been vaguely aware of what's been happening. Australia's been doing something similar for a long time because they've had similar issues. So it's an interesting kind of, yes. I think the precariousness of employment is affecting, as you say, it's not just a rural issue, it's across the board, and it's affecting more and more of the professional middle classes. And it probably has resulted in turmoil in Britain at the moment anyway. So politically, it's an interesting issue where migrants are seen as the source of everybody's problems. So that's another kind of interesting issue. And yet they're subject to the same global forces of technological changes, but I don't think they seem to see that at the moment, but perhaps they will. Any other questions? Any other comments? Even you don't have to ask questions, but I think that we have, I'm just trying to look at who's we started off with about 13, I think, apart from us, participants, and there are 6 people, or there's still 15 there. So has anybody else got any questions or comments they'd like to put to Diane and Ray? No? Any final comments that you'd like to make, Ray, Diane?
No, I've pleased to do it. I think there are a lot of issues that are addressed here. Not all of them have directly to do with mobility, but they certainly have to do with the background, the context in which certainly rural to urban mobility and urban to rural mobility, such as this happens. And I think the important thing is to keep in mind that if we're going to initiate policy, we have to identify the groups for which it is needed and who will benefit most from it, and try to avoid some of the broad one policy fits all kind of approaches that sometimes have been initiated.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have been struggling with that in the UK as well, because, you know, we have all this data around the index of multiple deprivation and so on. And the local government policies have been seen to be too broad brushed and not nuanced enough. But I think what is often lacking is the fine-grained data analysis that's needed to develop policies from, at least in the, you know, in Scotland. It's a struggle to get the kind of data that even sometimes you have, at least that Ray has pulled together in the. It's getting better, but you know, for remote rural areas, it's very thin on the ground. It's very challenging to get the data you need to devise policies. So you know, we continue to have very scattergun sort of policies rather than very targeted. And it's becoming even a more important issue in the context of budgetary cuts that we are experiencing in the public sector. So, so an important point. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank those of you, Patrick, Dan, who've, sorry, don't want to pick on you, but I notice your names there, and Linamar, who asked some questions, and I hope the rest of you that have participated in it have got something out of it. And you're very welcome to contact Diane and Ray and ask them specific questions if I think they don't mind. They offered to do that, but also to, you know, we'd be very happy to share any research that you're involved in. You could just send it to the RPLC contact on the emails that have gone out, and I'm sure we'd be happy to put these on the website or to publicize them. And certainly, I'm Philomena de Lima, by the way, and you can also, I think you can find me on the RPLC website, and you're very welcome to contact me as well directly, should you wish to do so. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day. I know it's 11 o'clock there, so and thank you very much, Diane and Ray, for putting it together. It's been a pleasure, really, to find this is the last of our webinars for this year anyway, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.
Bye.